At 10:52 in the morning, high above frozen northern Europe, one young gunner looked out of a tiny plexiglass window and realized he was about to die. The sky ahead was clean and blue. The sky behind was boiling with black dots that were growing fast. In less than a minute, 12 German fighters would be screaming toward his bomber. In 4 minutes, most of them would be gone. And the way this one gunner chose to fight back would quietly change air combat forever. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. The bomber was already shaking before the fighters appeared. Ice had formed along the wings. Engines droned at full power, fighting thin air and bitter cold. Every man on board could feel it in their bones. This was not just another mission. This was deep penetration into enemy airspace, the kind of flight crews whispered about the night before and tried not to think about when morning came. It was December 20th, 1943. The United States Army Air Forces were in the middle of a brutal daylight bombing campaign over Germany. The II's goal was simple on paper and deadly in reality: destroy the industrial heart of the Third Reich by bombing factories, shipyards, and rail hubs in broad daylight, without fighter escort for most of the journey. Bremen was one of the most dangerous targets of all. It was a city wrapped in flak guns, radar stations, and fighter bases. The aircraft cutting through that sky was a Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress, assigned to the 358th Bomb Squadron of the 303rd Bomb Group. The B-17 was famous for its durability, but reputation did not stop cannon shells. Crews joked that the name Flying Fortress was more hope than fact. Everyone knew someone who had not come back. Inside the bomber were 10 men, each locked into a role that left little room for error: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, waist gunners, ball turret gunner, and at the very rear, the radio operator and tail gunner. That position belonged to Staff Sergeant Forrest L. Vosler. Vosler was only 22 years old. Came from the small town of Lyndonville, New York, a place of farms, quiet roads, and long winters. Before the war, he had worked ordinary jobs and listened to radio broadcasts, never imagining that one day he would be operating a radio at 25,000 feet over enemy territory, surrounded by gunfire. Like most gunners, he had volunteered. Like most gunners, he understood the risk. The tail gunner's position was the most isolated spot on the aircraft. Vosler sat facing backward, separated from the crew by long metal corridors. He watched the sky behind them for hours at a time. There was no armor plate thick enough to make him feel safe. If fighters attacked from the rear, he would see them first and feel them last. By late 1943, German fighter pilots knew the tail gunner well. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was fast, agile, and heavily armed. German pilots were trained to attack bombers in short, violent bursts, firing cannon rounds and breaking away before gunners could track them. Most attacks came from behind or from above, where bombers were weakest. Vosler had already survived previous missions. He knew the rhythm of combat. He knew fear. He knew the sound of flak bursting close enough to rattle teeth. But nothing prepared him for what happened next. As the bomber formation neared Bremen, German flak batteries opened fire. Black bursts filled the sky, each one throwing jagged metal in every direction. One shell exploded near Vosler's tail section. Shrapnel tore through his equipment. A piece of metal struck his legs. Another ripped across his face. Blood flowed instantly, freezing against his skin. His oxygen line was damaged. Breathing became difficult. Vosler could barely see. Any reasonable man would have been evacuated from his position. Any reasonable man would have called for help. Vosler stayed where he was. He wiped blood from his eyes. He fixed what he could. He leaned forward and kept watching the sky. At 11:07 a.m., the fighters appeared. They came out of the sun and clouds behind the formation, dark shapes moving fast. Vosler recognized them immediately. Messerschmitt Bf 109s. He counted them without trying. 4, then more, then too many. They were flying closer together than usual, pushing straight in. That meant confidence. That meant they expected him to react the way every tail gunner did. Vosler felt fear, but it was sharp and controlled. In that moment, something clicked. The German pilots believed the tail gunner would fire early, forcing them to break off before they got too close. That belief had kept many of them alive. Vosler decided not to give them that chance. He did not fire. The fighters kept coming. Their engines grew louder. The crosses on their wings were now clear. He could see movement in cockpits. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the moment where hesitation meant death. Then Vosler pulled the triggers and held them down. The twin 50 caliber machine guns erupted, filling the tail section with noise and vibration. Tracer rounds formed a solid stream of fire, reaching straight into the approaching fighters. At that speed, there was no time to dodge. The first Bf-109 flew directly into the bullets. Its engine burst into flames and the aircraft snapped violently away. The second fighter tried to roll clear but clipped the wreckage of the first. It spun downward, trailing smoke. A third was hit squarely in the nose. Vosler never stopped firing. He tracked the center of mass, not individual planes. Fighters were forced to fly through the same deadly space if they wanted a shot at the bomber. For 4 minutes, the sky behind the B-17 became a trap. Vosler's guns overheated, ammunition belts jammed. He cleared them with numb fingers. Blood covered the controls. His vision narrowed as oxygen deprivation set in. Still, he stayed conscious. Still, he fired. German fighters that pressed too close were shredded. Those that survived broke away hard. Their attack shattered. By 11:11 a.m., the assault was over. The air behind the formation was suddenly empty. No more engines, no more tracers, only smoke drifting downward and silence rushing past the tail. Vosler slumped in his seat. He had lost a dangerous amount of blood. He was nearly blind. He had done far more than his body could handle. But his bomber was still flying. Later analysis credited Vosler and overlapping fire from nearby bombers with the destruction of at least 12 Bf-109s during that single attack. German records confirmed heavy losses in that sector at the same time. Luftwaffe pilots reported that close rear attacks had become deadly against American bombers that held fire until the last second. The B-17 barely made it back to England, landing at RAF Station Kimbolton. Vosler was carried from the aircraft on a stretcher. Doctors were unsure if he would recover his sight. He spent months in hospitals, slowly healing. On October 2, 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt awarded Forrest L. Vosler the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his courage, endurance, and devotion to duty. Vosler stood quietly during the ceremony, uncomfortable with attention. But the real impact of that day reached far beyond one man. German fighter tactics changed. Rear attacks were reduced. Head-on attacks became more common, a move that brought its own risks. On the Allied side, gunner training shifted. Crews were taught to wait longer, fire closer, and coordinate fields of fire. Bombers were no longer just targets, they were weapons. The daylight bombing campaign continued, still costly, still brutal. But something had changed. German pilots no longer attacked with the same confidence. Every approach carried more risk. Vosler returned home after the war and lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke about what he had done. When asked, he said he was just trying to protect his crew. He said he was scared the whole time. That honesty is what makes the story endure. High above Germany, on a freezing December morning, one wounded gunner refused to blink. In 4 minutes, he proved that courage, discipline, and timing could rewrite the rules of the sky. And long after the guns fell silent, the echo of that decision continued to shape air combat forever. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.